Welcome to this session today. This is for the MA Political Economy and MA Public Policy. I'm going to be talking to you about interviewing. Just a brief introduction. My name is Michael Kandiah, and I am based in the Department of Political Economy. I'm actually a historian, and the reason I'm talking to you today is that my principal method of collecting data is using interviews and other oral techniques. The use of oral data gathering is widespread right across the arts, humanities, and social sciences. I will be just giving you a brief introduction today. It's a tool which has been crafted increasingly since the 1980s, and we are now using this tool quite effectively and quite usefully for our purposes of research. Why does a researcher need to collect oral data? That probably is the first question you should ask yourself. Now, you should collect oral data for what might appear to be a perfectly obvious reason, and that is to say, to gain information from participants. This is so obvious it should go without saying, but it needs to be said. If you ask people about what they think, they will tell you about it. And the second reason is to find out about people's experiences. People will tell you about their experiences. Now, this can sometimes be seen as a perhaps not such a positive thing. Some people claim that oral data gathering is just about people's experiences. How reliable is it? Well, if that is what you want to do, if you want to find out about people's insights, people's information, people's experience, that is why you should be using it. Another reason to gather oral data is to generate various things, generate various insights and concepts for you to think about. Now, the reason and the way you do this is when you interview people or when you gather oral data, you will get a range of information, and you can use this for in a number of different ways, and it can be incredibly useful. The next reason to do it is to search for patterns. Now, if you interview a number of people or a group of people, you might be able to see patterns. You might be able to see commonalities. This could be very useful depending on your research project. You'd be able to see collective experiences, collective mythologies, collective ideas, shared experiences. So the patterns that emerge from oral interviews can be quite interesting to unpick for the purposes of research. Now, not only can we look for patterns, but we can also look for extremes, for differences, for idiosyncratic cases. Now, again, depending on your research, this could be very important to look for dissidents who have different ways of experiencing things, who have different thoughts, who have different ideas. Again, this will all depend on what your research project is. But if it needs to actually document a range of experiences, it can be really helpful to collect oral data. Now, of course, one of the things which you should also be doing, particularly for an MA dissertation in this department, is using it to validate hypotheses. Now, all of you will be using various types of hypotheses, and you should be using the oral data collection to validate your hypothesis, or in some cases to see if your hypotheses work or don't work. Because remember, one of the points about sort of documenting idiosyncratic or extreme cases is that maybe you'll find data that contradicts, and then you may need to shift and to make your analysis more nuanced. This can be very helpful. And again, this is where if you talk to people and analyze data correctly, you can gather some very interesting and very useful information. Now, not only can we look for patterns, but we can also look for extremes, for differences, for idiosyncratic cases. Now, again, depending on your research, this could be very important to look for dissidents who have different ways of experiencing things, who have different thoughts, who have different ideas. Again, this will all depend on what your research project is. But if it needs to actually document a range of experiences, it can be really helpful to collect oral data. Now, of course, one of the things which you should also be doing, particularly for an MA dissertation in this department, is using it to validate hypotheses. Now, all of you will be using various types of hypotheses, and you should be using the oral data collection to validate your hypothesis, or in some cases to see if your hypotheses work or don't work. Because remember, one of the points about sort of documenting idiosyncratic or extreme cases is that maybe you'll find data that contradicts, and then you may need to shift and to make your analysis more nuanced. This can be very helpful. And again, this is where if you talk to people and analyze data correctly, you can gather some very interesting and very useful information. Oral data gathering can also be used for quantitative research purposes. Oral data is used to start the process for statistical analysis and also to use the data gathered from a large number of respondents on a particular or a range of issues and use this to number crunch. Now, I'm not going to be talking about this in any detail in this talk. That will be covered by Professor Mortimer in his, but it is important for me to flag it up because oral data is used in this way and it is a very important tool in quantitative data collection. I'd like to conclude this section by talking to you about the types of information that are obtainable. Now, what you're going to be getting from interviewing people is individual narratives. If you're interviewing individuals, an individual will talk about what they know about, what their point of view is, what they believe. So it'll give you an individual narrative. The other important point, and this can be really very useful depending on your type of research and what you're hoping to unpick in your research, is that you will find, and what will also be revealed, are fronts. These are things like socially acceptable norms. These socially acceptable norms may be very important for you to know, but even if it is not, perhaps one of the things you might wish to do when you interview people is understand that there are socially acceptable norms which you need to understand will be present in any interview you take, in no matter what culture you undertake it in, no matter where you undertake. It is always done within a particular cultural milieu which you need to be aware of. Particularly if you interview groups of people, but this is also true if you interview individuals. they will be communicating group narratives. Now, the reason for this is that we are all not only individuals, we're also part of groups, we're part of subgroups, we're part of multiple groups, so on and so forth. And depending on the type of questions you ask and the sort of research that you're undertaking, these group narratives will be reflected. Now, again, even if you're not necessarily seeking to find group narratives, it's important for you to know they exist, and it is important for you to understand the place of these narratives in your research and use it to better understand the information that you have. Finally, what will also be obtainable are myths and mythologies. Now, there are different ways of sort of thinking about what a myth is, but let me give you just one example, and that is from a very important oral historian called Alessa Portelli. Portelli found that it was actually very useful to know if there were group myths and particularly group lies that people remembered. Now, the point of that is that if groups of people or even individual believe things which are potentially just obvious and demonstrable lies, they may be very useful. Now, I would like to scale back and point out that not all myths are lies, but that is an extreme. But the point is, these things are revealed, and depending on your research projects, can be very useful for you to unpick, understand, and see the context of. Now, if you want to know more about this, I draw your attention to the book which I've mentioned at the bottom of the slide, and that is the Rubens book on qualitative interviewing, The Art of Hearing. This book was published over a quarter of a century ago, but it is very well written, and I can certainly recommend it. Moving on, I'm going to be talking very briefly about structured interviews and surveys. For this section, I would recommend that you listen to Professor Mortimer's presentation because he's the expert on this field. But I think it's important for me to place this within sort of the whole issue of surveys and structured interviews within this broader context, because in some ways it needs to be understood within the broader way we look at interviewing and oral histories. It could be said that at the other extreme of the spectrum of interviewing, if we take the structured interviewing as one end, the other end is unstructured interviewing. Now, unstructured interviewing in the academic literature is sometimes described as oral histories, it's sometimes described as in depth interviews. So, if you see these different labels, it's in this broader area. What are unstructured interviews? Well, these are interviews which are completely open ended in many ways. They ask open ended questions. Um, they can go on for as long as the interviewee and the interviewer like. In some cases, they can literally go on for many, many, many hours. And it is mostly interviewee driven in the sense that the interviewer is there to just facilitate the interviewee from talking and giving as much information as is possible to give. In some ways, you might also come across this technique as being called a life history. And that is actually for a very good reason. It is because very often these are used to capture an interviewee's life. It can be driven entirely by the interviewee. The interviewee can talk about whatever he or she wants to talk about, and it's about a life. Now, if that's what you want to do, that's the this is what you need to. This is the technique you need to use. Now, there are many reasons why a researcher might want to undertake this type of interviewing technique. Because it is so in depth and it's so expansive, it can really uncover and can clarify meanings. It can really tell you a huge amount about in experience and what a person thinks about, exactly what they mean, exactly how they have thought about their life, what sort of life they believe they led, and so on and so forth. In some ways, this is what some some people have talked about thick description. There's a huge amount of information which can be gathered about experience, and if that's what you want, again, this is a technique which will generate a lot of information. Any and all interviewing techniques have their disadvantages, and you need to think very carefully about embarking upon on any project. What is the one that you need to use? Now, for this kind of unstructured interview, there are a number of disadvantages. One of which is something called the interviewee effect. Now, an interviewer effect is in some ways reasonably easy to explain uh, because the interview is so extensive. The interviewer and the interviewee are interacting with each other, and it is being sort of where does the interviewer's questions lead the interviewee and the presence of the interviewer, all these things are going to shape how the interviewee reacts. So, for example, if I were to interview you, it will be a particular sort of interview. But if somebody else were to interview you, it would be a slightly different interview. And similarly, if there were a third person to interview you, this is what's called, broadly speaking, the interviewer effect, because each of us will interact with each other in a slightly different way. Now, this means it's not really repeatable. Uh, if that's okay with you, that's fine. And that can be a sort of a positive thing because sometimes you may need to interact with people in very particular sorts of ways. And some people may need to feel comfortable when they talk to an interviewer. And again, then that's an absolutely good thing. But you have to understand it is that the interviewee will be present in any interview that takes place. It's non repeatable. And perhaps finally, and most important of all, it is time consuming. These types of interviews are extremely time consuming, both for the interviewer and for the interviewee. It can go on for, as I suggested earlier, sometimes for hours. It can be hours and hours of interview. And if you're happy with that, that's fine. If that's the kind of information you wish to, obtain, that's fine. But if you are very pressed for time, you may think very carefully about using this technique because it takes so much of your time. You really need to think very carefully if you want to spend this amount of time on an interview with one person or with several people or with a group of people. I'd like to move on to another technique, and this is a technique which most MA students undertake. Not all, but most. And that's partly because it's so adaptable and it can achieve so much. And it's called a number of different things, but very often it is called a semi-structured interview. This, as I said, is a technique which most MA students use, and indeed most academics as well. There are a number of reasons why semi-structured interviews are used so extensively, and that's principally because the technique of semi-structured interviewing is very adaptable. It allows the researcher to hone the interview to what they want to do. And so, I mean, for instance, most semi-structured interviews are organized very thoroughly. They generally have a list of questions organized in a particular order. Now, I know that the issue of order is covered in Professor Mortimer's talk, so I'm not going to be speaking too much about that here. Do listen to his talk about the effect of how you order questions, because how you order questions can affect, sort of how people respond. But just to return to what I was saying, it has a list of questions whilst at the same time allowing the interviewee to be expansive. And it allows the interviewer, as the interviewee is talking, to probe and ask questions and to ask for more information, to ask for qualifications, and to get a much better and a more rounded view of anything and any subject which is which is under discussion. This is one of the main reasons why it is so heavily used. It allows both the interviewer and the interviewee to shape what they want to talk about and to keep it concentrated and to keep it going in very particular ways. And it's very, very useful for this reason. A semi-structured interview gathers information because it asks open-ended, elaborative questions. It asks questions which allow the interviewee to expand upon what he or she knows. It allows them to do that. It allows them to talk in enough detail whilst at the same time being guided by the interviewer about into refining points and so forth. And so it's again, the interviewer is able to get the interview's perspectives on events in a very finely crafted way. And that, of course, is one of the main advantages of this technique. The many advantages of the semi-structured interview technique is that it allows for specific information and for specific subjects to be explored. It 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 can sort of focus on the things which are important for the purposes of research. And because of the ability to to ask further questions, and it provides the opportunity to find out what is not known. So this can be in the case that sort of you walk into an interview, you're doing some, you interview somebody and they tell you something you weren't expecting to hear. It allows you to find out things which you weren't expecting to find out about. It can be really very helpful. It is this it's kind of it's built into the structure. That's why it's so good. It allows for a range of insights to be gathered from this whole from the whole interview, which can be comparatively short. Again, contrast that with the unstructured interview, the life history. I mean, that can go on for hours and hours. Something a well-designed semi-structured interview can be for about an hour, and you can get a lot of very specific information out in that period in time. What are some of the problems of the semi-structured interview technique? Well, first of all, it may not always be efficient, despite the fact that the interviewer can wish to hone everything down to, a very limited sort of set of questions and so forth. You still get quite a lot of information which may be extraneous. You can still sort of find yourself finding, sort of the interviewee can talk about things which really are not particularly relevant to what you want to know as a researcher. It is also potentially quite time consuming. Now, keep in mind, any interview takes time. So it's not only the time of the actual interview, it's the time that you take to prepare. It's the time you spend going there. It's the time you spend afterwards, sort of taking notes and categorizing and maybe transcribing. All these things need to be kept in mind. So it can be still quite time consuming, not necessarily as time consuming as a live interview or sort of an unstructured interview, but it's still time consuming. And like a as unstructured interview or live interview, there is going to be the sort of there's going to be an interviewer effect. You're interacting with somebody. The very fact that you, as the interviewer, are present is going to be is going to shape that interview, and that needs to be kept in mind. So it's not your presence as an interviewer is going to have an effect. And as with the previous technique of because there's an interviewer effect, there's going to be issues around repeatability and reliability, meaning to say that if I were to interview you, that's going to be one interview. If somebody else were to interview you, even with the same set of questions, there may be slight deviations. And if a third person, again, there may be slight deviations. So it's not going to be a perfectly repeatable or reliable type of interview. There can be a whole number of things going on. This needs to be built into your sort of your plan. And if you're happy with that, if it's the main way for you to collect this information, that's great. But if not, if you need a certain level of accuracy or sort of no deviation, maybe you need another technique. I'm going to move on from the individual to groups. So I'm going to be talking about focus groups and witness seminars in this next section. Why would you want to undertake a focus group or a witness seminar project? This is because you want to get information about a particular subject or a specific issue from a group of people. And it's the group of people that's important. Broadly speaking, this technique is done, sort of the data gathering is done through through a semi-structured group interview process, and it is moderated by the group leader or chair. Now, that is the group leader or chair is acting rather like the interviewer with a single interviewee. So that is just a slight change of term, but it's principally the same thing. It's the same object. It's just the interviewer is a single, and it's a group of people that are being dealt with. Now, organizing a focus group or a witness seminar can be quite complex because you're dealing with a group of people. So you have to ask yourself, what do you want to do? Do you want to have a very structured protocol? I mean to say, do you want to do it in a very structured fashion, asking questions in a very structured way, or do you want to see how the group behaves? If that's of you need to think quite carefully, because the two are quite different, and you're going to have to think about how this focus group or witness seminar works quite carefully before you set it out. So it actually is quite a lot of work. You're also going to have to ask yourself, do you need segmentation or stratification? What I mean to say is, do you need a group of people who are of the same age, sex, socioeconomic status, or health status? Or are you looking for different groups, different types of people, different ages, different things? This will affect the way you set the whole project out. How many people do you need to participate in a focus group? Now, do you need one focus group? Do you need more than one? You need to decide that. Usually, the number of people per group, uh, it's up to you, but it's usually the literature usually agrees between 6 and 10, and usually sort of more around 6 than the 10. This is because sort of actually handling a large number of people can be very difficult. This also means that you need to think the whole issue of the moderator needs to be thought very carefully about. Does the moderator or chair need to be involved a lot, or does he or she need to be involved a little? That needs to be thought out well in advance. These techniques need quite a lot of preparation beforehand. Now, most of you are likely to have heard of focus groups, but I doubt very many of you have heard of witness seminars, and I'm just going to very briefly tell you about the differences. Now, focus groups, which are very widely used, they're used not only in academic settings, they're also used by clinicians and very widely in market research as well. And indeed, some of you might have participated in a focus group in market research. It'll be interesting to know. But anyhow, the difference between a focus group and a witness seminar is that a focus group is usually undertaken between strangers. So if you undertake a focus group, usually you do not know the people within that focus group, or at least not deliberately. Whereas a witness seminar, usually the participants know each other. And that's got a lot to do with what is the nature of a witness seminar. And a witness seminar usually is there to examine an event or a sort of a movement or whatever with people who know each other and who are going to interact with each other. And the other difference is that there is an obvious audience with whom the participants may be able to interact. Now, again, if any of you have been to a focus group, particularly say a focus group for market research, there will be an audience, but you probably won't be able to see them. In academic settings, it's less clear cut whether there is an audience. But certainly, if you were to go for a commercial one, that's very likely you will be observed. But the point is that for a witness seminar, there is an audience and they interact, and that's because a witness seminar is much more an academic undertaking about a very specific subject or theme, which the people know each other, and the audience is also there that's informed. Now, for quite a large portion of my academic career, have organized these witness seminars, and I've organized them based on themes and projects. And very briefly, for example, I've been very interested to understand how embassies and high commissions work. And so I bring together diplomats who talk about their life experience. And in the audience, I have people and academics who are very well informed. So this is a widespread interaction of the chair, the participants, and an audience. And it's very interesting and very different from a focus group because it's a much wider sort of activity. The advantage of these techniques is that they produce a considerable amount of information within a relatively short period of time. That's because people are talking, and it's the talk provides the data. The other advantage of these techniques is that sometimes you get to find out about things which are otherwise unobservable, difficult to observe, or very sensitive. Now, very briefly, I'll sort of talk about how clinicians and people and medics have used, particularly focus groups. What they found is when they interview people with who have similar problems, shall we say, these people will reveal and talk about things which they might not even reveal to their physicians, because they're talking to people who are going through things very similar to themselves. And they can sometimes talk about things and talk about experiences which they might feel less comfortable talking to a medical professional about. Now, that is one of the many reasons why medics in particular have been using this, is because they found that this kind of information is better extracted from people when they have other people like them around them. So it can be quite helpful. So there's a lot of this kind of information, but there are also other kinds of unobservable things. So say, for example, you get to see how people just interact with each other. That can be very interesting and very useful if that's what you need to do, or if you think that would be an interesting thing to find out more about. Now, these techniques allow the researcher to target their topics of research for a group. And the other advantage, obviously, is that it allows for comparisons at a group level, which you can see in front of you, which the researcher can see in front of them. And that can be very useful if that's what they are interested in finding out. To my mind, the main advantage of these two techniques is the group effect. And the group effect can be described as such, and this is a quote: a kind of chaining or cascading effect, talks linked to or tumbles out of the topics and expressions preceding it. This is a quote from Lindoff and Taylor, again, a very good book called Qualitative Communications Research Methods. This is an extremely good book, and I strongly recommend it. But they've identified this sort of group effect, which I think many of us who use it know as being invaluable. There are other things which can be revealed in this group interaction, and that is native languages or vernaculars, which can help the researcher understand things. Now, why this can be very interesting is that language shifts and change over time, but also in place sometimes, and this might not always be apparent to a researcher. So, by actually observing it in a group, you can actually understand how language works and vernaculars of speech works. It can be really very interesting for you to observe that and perhaps even research it. And also, it might, give nuance to your research if that's what, is necessary. I've mentioned this, the next point before, and this is to do with the opportunity for disclosure amongst people who are similar to themselves. I've already talked about this in medical people who suffer from medical complaints. Feel more comfortable, but it's worth mentioning here as well, because sometimes people who share experiences, this can be very, very useful to see and to also get a lot of information out from them. as there are always disadvantages, and one of the big disadvantages of focus groups and witness seminars is the lack of control and irrelevant information. You obviously have less control because you've got a whole number of people, and there's the danger of a lot of irrelevant information being generated, which may be a problem for you just to deal with. And of course, slightly more importantly, is that the data may be very difficult to analyze because that group effect, which I was talking about earlier, can be a wonderful thing. It can reveal all sorts of things, but at the same time, it can in fact make the analysis much more difficult, more complex, more confusing to you. So you have to be very careful when you're with the data you collect. You need to be very careful when unpicking it, and it's not as simple as it sounds. There are other problems which need to be taken into account, and that is, unlike interviews, the moderator's chair, or i.e., the interviewers, need to be trained and they need to be highly disciplined. It is much more difficult to manage a group of people than a single individual. The other point in this is to do with the groups. They can be, depending on the group, they can be quite variable, but also they can be very difficult to assemble and manage. These things can be very difficult because, particularly in terms of assembly, trying to get people into a single room, sort of may not be as easy as it sounds. Even for you, it might be a very good thing. The other people involved might not necessarily think that, and if it's your project to actually, have a group interview with a number of people, they might not necessarily think it that way. So it might be difficult to assemble. The other thing which you also have to need to be sort of think quite a lot about is that the problem with something like this is that, are the people representative of a population? Is this important to you? If, for example, you're trying to make the case that these people that you've had a focus group or witness seminar are representative of a lot of things, or of a sample population, well, that might not be the case, and your findings might not be what they are. You're going to have to think very, very carefully about that. I think the final point, and that is to say, with the is anonymization of information. The very fact that you've got different people talking to each other in a group means that the anonymity, if that is what is essential, is compromised by the very fact that different people are in a room. Whether or not they know each other, there is always a potential for breaches of anonymity, breaches of information, which is revealed during a focus group or a witness seminar. And if that's a problem, you need to think very carefully, and you need to build in protocols to prevent breaches of information or the lack of anonymity and whatnot. So it can be quite complicated. Think very, very carefully about undertaking these techniques. I'd like to now move on to ethical issues which need to be considered before undertaking um, anything, any of the techniques which I've mentioned. And it is very important that you consider ethics, because ethical research is important for any research which is undertaken within any university, and especially at King's College London. Why, especially King's College London, you might be asking yourself? Well, that's largely because the fact that I'm one of the people who runs the college governance in this area myself. I am part of the College Research Ethics Committee, and I'm one of the people that's responsible for good ethical research in the college. If you want to find out more about the college's research ethics, do click on the link, or sort of type out the link that I've given you here. This will take you to the Research Ethics Office. The College Research Ethics Office is an absolutely important stop for you to go to. The web pages contain a huge amount of information. It also gives you templates for documents you will need to use. You will also provide you with a vast amount of information relating to how the college expects you to behave, the levels of risk that are involved if you need to submit um, sort of how you need that you what are the circumstances that you will need to submit a high risk application, etc. The point is that any interaction you have with a living individual for the purpose of the research, you will have to inform the college and you will have to receive ethical clearance. And the College Research Ethics Office provides this. So you will have to go through the system and you will need to check these web pages out. So just to repeat a point that I've made, any interaction with human beings, living individuals, for the purpose of research has to be cleared from the college. And when it is clear, then you can go, only at that point should you go ahead and do your research. It needs to be done in particular sorts of ways, and participants whom you are going to be researching need to be informed of the purpose of the study. They need to know exactly what their participation will involve. They need to understand how their confidentiality will be protected. They also need to know how their information will be used and stored. Again, go to the college Research Ethics Office pages to find out a lot more about all of these points. Basically, the single principle that all this is bound by is the principle of informed consent, which we expect you to be guided by. Again, as I said, go to the college website pages to find out more about this. In those web pages, you will see what's called a consent form and an information sheet, which in many cases you will ask the participants to. We will ask you to provide to the participants. Depending on the individuals, you might need to get them to sign the consent form so they formally show that they give you consent that you can use their sort of their interview. And in the information sheet, it should provide all the information relating to your project, what kind of a project it is, etc., etc. All of this is very important, and all of this information is on the college website that I've already pointed out to you. Finally, there are other considerations which it is important for you to consider before embarking upon any kind of interviewing. These considerations are legal ones, and you need to be aware of the law. You need to be aware of the law in the country you're conducting your research, or if it's in the UK. I mean, for example, if it's in the UK, you need to understand UK law as it relates to your research, project, but also your obligations within UK law. And if you're interviewing in another country, you need to be aware of the law of other countries. So that's what that obviously is there. But also, you need to be aware that as a student at a UK university, you are broadly covered by UK law and UK traditions. And in particular, oral data data collection is bound by the Data Protection Act of 2018 and GDPR. Now, GDPR is the general, I can't remember, it's related to data protection. So you have to you have to make sure that your data is collected in particular ways that doesn't breach these two acts. It's really very important that you do not do that because there are severe penalties if you breach them. The other thing is that you also must be aware of other aspects of the law which you might not necessarily be aware. And the one that I bring to your attention is the Disability Discrimination Act. Now, by that I mean to say is that, say, for example, if you cannot exclude people just based on it might be a bit of a bother to interview somebody because they're disabled in some way. So you need to be aware of these things. I bring that up because it's actually quite important in terms of equity, but also in terms of you just simply shouldn't be excluding people from research just because they're disabled in some way, shape, or form, unless it's there are very good reasons for it. And finally, and most importantly, you need to understand that interviews are bound by the law of copyright. And in particular, in Britain, the law of copyright means that the interview is jointly shared between the interviewee and the interviewer. Now, this is actually makes it kind of difficult to unpick what that actually means. But the point is, it's a joint ownership, and you need to respect the joint ownership. And that is why, in particular, we point out that anybody you interview needs to understand exactly what they're committing to and where their data is stored. Again, go back to the College Research Ethics Committee's website for more information. Okay, thank you, everybody. I hope you found this presentation interesting, and I will look forward to hearing your questions in the live session. Thank you, everybody. Bye-bye.